So let me start off by asking you about your intellectual origin. Like, where are you from in terms of China research? What brought you to this fantastic career?
I don't know if if fantastic is the right word, but it's certainly been interesting and exciting. I first became interested in China as a university student now 25 years ago. I did my junior year abroad in Beijing at the Beijing Institute of Technology. And I arrived 1 month before China joined the WTO. And I knew immediately on the bus ride from the old airport in Beijing, which is to our dorm at Beijing Institute of Technology, I was just hooked immediately. Part of it was I grew up in rural America. I grew up in Vermont, and I'd never been to a place as large as Beijing. But there was also in the days and weeks and months after landing, Beijing in the fall of 2001 had an energy about it that was it was this energy of sort of an optimism about where China was going and about the future of it. There was optimism amongst Chinese students who were there, who were thinking about this new world of possibility as China was now formally integrating into it was less about integrating into a formal trading system. I think it was more what that represented of China now really becoming a global player. Foreign companies were starting to come into China. And of course, I would just say politically, there were views that I heard in Beijing then about trajectories China could take that were compelling to me then. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but my own view is I'm frustrated with a lot of the discussion here in the U.S. that assumes where China is now politically was a preordained, was a fixed path that China traveled because of the political Leninist institutions under the rule of the Communist Party of China. And I've always found that there were lots of paths China could take. And certainly in 2001, it felt like there were paths available for it to take that were different from where it is today. So that was a really formative experience that first year there. And I then returned in 2007, moved to Shanghai. And I think for the point of our discussion here, probably the important event for me was in 2010. I was up having a meeting near Renmin University, and I heard about this bookstore that was run by these neo-Maoists. Wuyou Zhishang was the name of the bookstore, and I thought I'll go check it out. And their bookstore was sort of close to I guess it would have been the north gate of Renmin University. And that set off a whole new chapter, figuratively and literally, because I ended up writing a book about them. But I just thought that was this. I just remember everything about walking into that bookstore. And what was fascinating about it to me is it was filled with young Chinese, many of the students I'd met, but unlike most of the students I'd met, many of them were thinking about getting careers with McKinsey consulting or, going and studying, in the US. These people were sitting on the staircase in the bookstore or huddled in a corner, and they were reading, Mao Zedong Sixiang, or they, Mao thought. They were reading the works of Lenin. So that's probably really that one random experience of going into the Utopia bookstore was probably the most important event of how I got to where I am today. And it's where I essentially began to move towards a career in trying to understand that paradox to me of China's modernizing, it's globalizing, and yet there's people who want to go back, who want to return to the roots of, a much more, small c communist system.
I guess I can relate to some of that. So I actually went to college in 2002. And back in the days, and I think it's still the case now, that there's a mandatory like Marxism classes, a set of them to take, right? So there's Marxist political economy, Marxist political other thought, and variety of stuff. And what I remember the most was that back in college, I would have one class of Marxist political economy, and then followed by a Western, microeconomics 101. And then the dissonance is jaw-dropping, because you will listen to all these things about public ownership, and then you study a micro 101, and everything was like, we're not supposed to have that in China, because that's according to the last class, right? We are not supposed to have the stuff in this class. And so I can certainly understand why some people, because of the dissonance, right? Cognitive dissonance is something very unpleasant. Some people might go back to the Mao extreme, while some other people might want to have even more freedom.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting to me is in some ways we've learned subsequently that there might not be as much of a tension between some of these what seem like polar opposites of, state and market. That actually there's more fluidity between. They're not like two polar opposite ends of some, or it's not some binary. So part of the journey for me was not only exploring tensions and finding them, trying to find out how those tensions coexisted. In some sense, the whole experience of China's political economic model from, post 89 has been proving in some sense that there is more, there's more space for collaboration, I guess, between the state and the market than ideologically I grew up thinking, right? I grew up in very much an era where it was sort of there was the market, or there was the state. And, here in the United States, we're having discussions about industrial policy. We're using much more state intervention on trade and tariff policy. So in some ways, I feel like China was just the first one to start thinking about a hybrid socialist market economy. And in some ways, it's dragged a lot of countries in its direction.
But what would you think about this counter argument, which is, so you mentioned the conventional way of discussion about China in the United States. I think one of those main thoughts, schools of thought, would be following the work by last year's Nobel Prize in Economics winner Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson. Their argument is basically to say that usually economic freedom and political freedom, they go hand in hand, right? And China seemed like a successful counterexample because they don't have political freedom, but they have economic freedom, and which has led to impressive economic growth in the past decades. But according to these economists, they would say maybe that, I'm just guessing, but that's according to my reading of their work, right, is that this situation is not sustainable. So eventually China would either, there will be a strong enough demand for freedom that they will even have political freedom, they will even have democracy, and that would potentially, hopefully, solidify the pro-growth economic policy and economic freedom, economic institution. But the other side would be that, eventually they would just go back to, doom. The reason, I guess, the last 10 years seems to be proving them kind of right? At least the trend seems to be consistent with this more pessimistic forecast. Now, what do you think about that framework?
I think if that book came out in 1980, it would have looked remarkably inaccurate, because it describes the necessary conditions for even the necessary conditions to achieve the sort of growth enhancing structure that Acemoglu and Johnson and others point out. You would have thought that the Chinese experiment of producing a admittedly state-driven but nonetheless market economy would not have gotten off the ground. And the other point is, I'm not celebrating all of the policy choices Beijing has made since 1976. But I do think traditional models of sort of neoclassical models of economic growth have never been good about in their predictive ability on China, which has always defied in many ways the laws of economic gravity. Now, your last point, I think, is a good one, which is time will tell if actually the sort of Asamoglu criticism of extractive institutions is correct. And I think there's clearly it's clear to me that the political structure in China right now is the single biggest inhibitor of rejuvenation of China. Now, I guess the question is, if let's say Xi Jinping had not won the leadership contest, and Li Keqiang had come out in top, and at the 18th Party Congress in the fall of 2012, Li Keqiang came out first when they announced the standing committee. I guess a question for you, do you think we would be where we are today? So I guess, in other words, is the argument you made, which I sort of agree with, that the last 10 years have shown maybe the limitations of the China model and the ability to have a Goldilocks of state intervention and dominance with a vibrant market economy. Is that a structural tension? And inevitably, it was going to land where it is today, or are there contingent factors like Xi Jinping? And I think you could have the same discussion about the United States right now, right? Is Donald Trump cause or symptom? So I guess I got to throw that out there. And I actually don't know how to reconcile those, because in some sense I think structure matters, and having a political organization like the Communist Party, which has little to no internal checks and balances, and even internal to the party had very, very weak internal checks on power. Is that necessarily an inhibitor to having a semi-vibrant market economy, or is it that plus you need a leader like Xi Jinping who has a clear vision of where he wants to take the country, and his vision does not include a flourishing civil society and market? So I don't know. I don't know where you come down on that.
Yeah. So I not that I believe in the argument I made. I was making basically on their behalf.
Devil's advocate.
The paraphrase there. So I kind of think about it goes back to what we believe, or each of us believe, the reason for China's earlier success. Like what made China's economy so successful, like in the 90s, right, 80s, 90s, and including a good part of 2000s. And I came down on, I think, the power of the incentives on local government officials to grow the economy, and everything I think comes down to comes down to money, because if you look at the local government budgets, a large part of that is from auctioning, selling land, right, to developers, and the way it works is actually pretty magical, because according to the Chinese law, so land could either be state-owned versus collectively owned, like in countryside, right? But so the law basically says urban land has to be owned by the state, and then lands in the countryside, they are collectively owned. But what is urban versus what is countryside, right? The suburbs, the boundary is drawn by the state. And so every now and then you think about like Shanghai, or wherever the big cities that everyone has been to, they started very small, right? But then over the years, the Chinese government says, now Shanghai is a little bigger, and then now we are even bigger. So they redraw the line every now and then. And every time they redraw, the land that got newly included inside the city boundary becomes state-owned, and that became revenue sources for local governments, right? So they started to sell. And I think my view is that the tricky, this is so important because land is complementary to a lot of other economic conditions. So your land would not be valuable if you have a a very poor economy. And so in order to sell the land at a high price, local governments started to have strong incentives to provide economic institutions, pro-growth economic institutions. They would try to attract investors, like free electricity, right, free water or free whatnot, so that they can set up factories in their cities rather than other cities. And I think the idiosyncratic factor of Xi Jinping, which is what you raised, Jude, is very important here because I think ever since Xi took office, he started to get his hands on this city, local government's finances. The central government started to require that, there's obviously a real estate bubble, but then the central government wanted to step in. They wanted to see whether there's corruption in the dealing of the land sales. Of course, there's corruption in the dealing of the land sale, because that's the grease that makes the wheel works, right? And so I think especially recent years, I think the central government is getting even more involved in the revenue source from land sales for local governments. And I think that destroys basically a large part of the Chinese economic institutions. And so now, what that means to the political versus economic institutions discussion is that I think it's hard for central governments to not try to get their hands in local government's pockets. Right? That requires restraint. Right? And restraint is not reliable. And so maybe that's to Ajamolo's point, is that if you don't have a good political institutions to prevent central governments from extraction, right? This is the example of extractive institutions. Then even if temporarily local governments have good incentives to grow the economy, that incentive will not last very long.
Yeah, I guess it also, we probably didn't define clearly enough the terms of what we're talking about. If in terms of maybe just moving away from Asamoglu for a second. What strikes me about the last 2015, so 13 years of the Xi administration is deliberate attempts to rewire incentive structures across the entirety of the system, including at the local level, provincial level, and then, of course, between provinces in the center and localities in the center. There's been a deliberate effort to remake the development model that makes it, to me, slightly difficult to disentangle a longer storyline of sort of 78 to today. 2012 probably wasn't the real disjuncture. That probably came later. I'd be curious for you, when is the clear demarcation line within the Xi administration, the Xi Jinping period, from business as usual in terms of political actor incentive structures, and then just something very new? I mean, it feels like there were clear moments along the way that in the aggregate rewired the incentive structure, but it's hard to identify just one moment. But you've had so many deliberate interventions, just even moving backwards in time. The 3 red line policy in 2020, fall of 2020, which is really one of the single biggest contributors to why China is having China's growth has been slowing for since 2011, but the more precipitous decline in growth it was a result of deliberate choices made on COVID policy, and then messing around in the real estate sector, which was a massive contributor to China's growth. Also, of course, was in rewiring local government. You essentially rewired local government finances by virtue of taking away one of the biggest revenue sources, i.e. land transactions. You had the revision of the Constitution in 2018 to get rid of the term limit on the office of the presidency. You had Xi Jinping elevating himself to the position of the core in 2016. 2014, you have the announcement of the holistic national security, the Zongti Anquanguan, holistic national security concept, and then just the explosion of the national security state both de jure and de facto, right? A new national security commission, national security laws. So again, coming back to the story, and I don't know the answer to this, and how much of where we are today is this in the person of Xi Jinping, who wasn't just sort of passively riding a vessel which had already been launched and was on its own trajectory. I mean, he got on the boat and decided he wanted to steer this in a I think, not a dramatically different direction, but certainly a different direction from where the two previous leadership groups had wanted to take China. And so again, I guess the only point I'm making is I am skeptical of stories about China's development and explaining today by going back to the sort of 1990s. Not that contingent, or not that heritage and lineage don't matter, but it strikes me the longer Xi Jinping is in power, the more I realize what a very, very different leader he is to previous Chinese leaders, and how much his policy and strategic choices have shaped where China is today, rather than there's some sort of gravitational pull of just by virtue of having a communist party in charge that gets you to where you are today.
So I fully understand what you're saying, Jude, and I think it probably will imply, I could see how you answer my next question, which is that how many ways do you think Xi Jinping could turn this economy around, like short of stepping down?
Look, I don't think there is a shortage of good ideas circulating within China by policymaker adjacent groups on a range of the issues China is facing right now: productivity slowdown, slack consumption, demographic challenges, local government finances. I guess a political puzzle about Xi Jinping to me is obviously has an extraordinary amount of political capital and power. If I were advising Xi Jinping, I would be saying priority number 1, 2, and 3 would be tax reform. Right? You have a, I think, a fundamentally broken, not only central tax system, but also, a local tax system that is affecting China's fiscal health and will certainly affect the ability of China to raise revenue to be able to fund the things that even Xi Jinping seeks to accomplish, let alone address many of the challenges that just structurally the government will have to deal with as it's sort of entering this phase where you're having an older society. It's going to put more pressure on the healthcare system, right? It's going to put more pressure on the pension system. It's going to put more pressure on households because they're living with their parents and who are going to start getting sick. So, in theory, Xi Jinping could do. There's a number of steps that I think are quite obvious that the leadership could take on market reforms. This doesn't require democratization, right? Like, much as we'd like to see that happen, just even within the paradigm of a technocratic authoritarian system that wants to do well, tax reform, fiscal reform, market reforms. Also, China's healthcare system is in a fairly bad state right now, especially when you go out to rural areas. It is in many ways far more capitalist than the United States healthcare system is. So, the work of Scott Rozelle out at Stanford, looking at some of the development challenges and educational challenges confronting rural children in China. There is a true rejuvenation strategy that the leadership in Beijing could pursue that would arguably put China in a much stronger competitive position globally by addressing some of these profound challenges it is facing internally. And in fairness, it's not like the United States is dealing with all the many fundamental challenges that we're facing as well. I mean, this is not unique to China, but so on paper, I think there are clear moves that the leadership could take. I just don't think Xi Jinping has any interest in these whatsoever. I think his primary concern is China's great power status, and he has a narrow definition of how you achieve great power status. I think he is fixated on geopolitical competition with the United States to the extent that he is taking his eye off the ball of what I think are much more pressing long-term challenges that China needs to be addressing. Again, tax and fiscal reform, healthcare reform, education reform. So I think I've been hearing since the third plenum in 2013, people say they're going to pivot to reform soon. They are not going to pivot to reform. It's 2025. And I would say the more problems the leadership in Beijing confronts, the more the geopolitical headwinds strengthen, the less likely they are to reform, right? It will take a very brave soul in Beijing right now to walk down the hall to Xi Jinping's office, knock on the door and say, comrade, we're going in the wrong direction. And I think actually geopolitical competition with the United States brings out Xi Jinping's worst instincts. I think it incentivizes him to sort of double down on indigenous innovation, self-reliance, on national security and optimization. I think it makes him much more hostile to, foreign capital. So all this, I think, the worse things get, the worse things will get, I guess, is my model for this.
Why isn't it a very simple, almost too intuitive recognition that national power eventually is economic power? And why doesn't he just realize that to win in any geopolitical competition, China would need a strong economy?
Well, I mean, let's continue to devil's advocate, and I always try to think within the framework of how policymakers are making decisions rather than what you and I think. Also, what is the information ecosystem surrounding policymakers making decisions? I can see a world in which Xi Jinping would say, you're right, economic power does matter. Guess what? BYD yesterday just announced that they've got new charging technology where I think they can fully charge a car within 5 minutes. DeepSeek just demonstrated that the entire U.S. model on needing massive amounts of money to train these models is wrong, and we did it on the cheap. I think he would look at successes China is making in robotics, battery technology, CATL, Huawei, which came back from the dead. So I think there's a world in which Xi Jinping is getting the briefing book, and the briefing book is saying, comrade, everything you're doing is working, right? Industrial policy is working. We are dominating in robotics, battery, EV. So this guy Weifeng sitting in America, who is saying that this model isn't working, what's he talking about? My colleague, who we were discussing before we started recording, Gerard DePippo, just wrote a recent piece for RAND, where I work, saying that there's almost two ways you could think about China's economy. There's the macro story and the micro story. The macro story is the slowdown story, right? That's the story of debt overhang. That's the story of the popping of the real estate bubble, which is having all these knock-on effects, especially on local government finances, the demographic challenges. That's the macro story. The micro story is the new economy story. Now, the new economy is a tiny, tiny fraction of China's overall economy, right? Both in terms of employment and output, but it's the one that's catching all the headlines, right? Again, think about all the companies, the BYDs, the Huaweis, the CATLs, the DeepSeeks. And so part of the problem is it kind of depends on what story you're looking at. Are you looking at the new economy story, in which case there's an argument that things are actually doing pretty well? Or are you looking at the macro story, in which case, China has a big, big problem? Now, I think similar to the discussion we were having a little bit early, the question is how sustainable are new economy successes as the political system continues down a trajectory of ever increasing political control? I think that's an incredibly valid question. But to this day, China is still producing some pretty remarkable breakthrough successes in technology. And I guess the key question is, because of or in spite of an autocratic political system sitting over it?
Well, maybe. So one could really say that the briefing book Xi Jinping got is really right. They could be correct. I mean, DeepSeek is really a pretty impressive success, right? And innovation coming from the need for because of all these restrictions on semiconductor chips the U.S. imposed on China. So they had to innovate their ways around, and they succeeded. And so, and I think the micro story, I would even argue that it could get into the macro level. If you think about there are countries where they seem to be they seem to have thrived under the condition of threats, external threats. Like if you think about Israel in the middle of the Arab nations in the Middle East, right? Or Japan has long been, it's rightfully so, worried about the lack of natural resources, and as an island nation, and then they perceive threats coming from outside. Singapore is maybe another example too, as a resource poor economy, and they succeeded, right? So maybe threat and adverse external environment could be an incentive, but that maybe that works for DeepSeek. I don't know whether that works for Xi Jinping.
I also, by the way, I think there's I think the story of DeepSeek is very distinct from the story of Chinese industrial policy. I don't think DeepSeek did not emerge and develop in the sort of ecosystem of Chinese industrial policy, right? DeepSeek was basically as close as you can get to a more private sector play. I mean, now Huawei is a very different story, right? CATL is a very, very different story. BYD is a very different story. So those companies, I think, are absolutely more. You can make an argument that is, and it's a podcast, so people can't see me, but I'm doing scare quotes. That is a success of industrial policy. Now, industrial policy, of course, you can't just pick the instances of winners. You need to look at the entirety of it and make an assessment of is it worth the money? And, Chinese industrial policy wastes a staggering amount of money on companies, projects, technologies that go nowhere. Every local government needs to have its new innovation, cluster. So there's a lot of money being thrown around. I don't know how many EV brands there are in China right now. I was just in Beijing a month ago, and I was seeing cars I'd never heard of before in my life. I think we have to parse very carefully the story of, is Chinese industrial policy working and why? I just think our conversation was a bit more about what would it take for Xi Jinping to get the feedback he needs to understand that the policy agenda needs to make a radical change. And I am certain the information he is getting is likely confirming that he's on the right path. And also, again, think about if you were his advisor and you were looking at the geopolitical headwinds, would you be saying now is the time to have the market allocating resources freely? Or would you be saying, we know where we need to go. We know the technologies we need, and we actually know that we have a limited amount of time to try to make breakthroughs in these. So I think there's probably not much of a free market vibe in Beijing, and frankly, I would say there's not much of a free market vibe in many Western capitals as well.
Much of the world, absolutely. So switching gear a little bit from the economic side to political side, what do you see the politics of China going, like, with the future of democracy, which is something that audiences of this journal are particularly interested in? We're trying to ever get there?
I think the unfortunate reality is, to me at least, the current leadership group under Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping himself will be there till he dies in office. I don't think there's anything unique about that. I think that is actually, there's a reason in America we celebrate the story of George Washington. It's because we know how abnormal it is to give up power. Donald Trump here in the United States has joked, not joked, about wanting to stay in power and called himself a king. This is why we passed a constitutional amendment. This is why in the 1982 constitutional reform in China, they put a term limit on the office of the presidency. It wasn't, they understood the need for some constraints. It's why Xi Jinping removed the term limit on the office of the presidency. I'd say I'm more open to the idea that it's not just Xi Jinping dying in office, that there could be some point down the road where mismanagement becomes so acute that elite dissent becomes stronger. These systems, Leninist systems, are pretty resilient to elite challenges. But my own view is we're really good at looking in the rear view mirror and explaining of political events that have happened, like the overthrow of the Assad regime in Syria, which I don't remember anyone predicting in the days and weeks before that happened. My own sense is Xi Jinping is pretty firmly ensconced in power, but I also know that when political ruptures occur, they're almost always not in the place that most of us were looking. But I would just say as a baseline, my sense is, Xi Jinping is relatively young, especially compared to American leaders. He's more than a decade younger. I think he's going to be in power for another 10 or 15 years. So really your question is a question of what next. And I'm not foolish enough to make any prediction about what happens. I think, unfortunately, the reality is that often cases when a leader of a authoritarian system, but autocratic system dies in office, the leader who comes after is in many instances worse and more illiberal. I think we probably overinterpret the Deng Xiaoping experience. That it is just I think we might think, well, we went from, with apologies to Hua Guofeng, we went from Mao to Deng, therefore that might be what happens after Xi Jinping. But I think if you look at the bulk of the evidence across autocratic systems, it is not normal that you go from a dictator to we could argue about whether Deng was a dictator or not, but certainly he held more pragmatic views than Mao did by a long shot. I don't know if we should bet that the leader coming after Xi Jinping will necessarily harbor more pragmatic attitudes. In many instances, so long as the party system survives and has resilience, it probably more likely the case that the person who wins the power struggle after Xi dies is someone who is pretty ruthless. So to be able to win that power struggle, you have to be pretty ruthless. I am honestly fairly pessimistic, but I'm also pessimistic about small L liberalism globally in general right now. I think it feels like in many ways we're at the end of a long cycle that started after World War II, certainly with its ups and downs, but it feels like that long cycle is coming to an end. A lot of the institutions that bolstered a globally rules-based liberal order are under severe attack. So this is not just a China phenomenon in many ways. I think this is a global phenomenon. So I'm very worried about the health of democracy everywhere. I'm worried about the health of democracy here in the United States, very much. So I think it's not just a matter of what's after Xi Jinping. I think the question is democracy as an idea and is democracy as a package of institutions fit to replicate itself moving forward?
Well, on that dark note, so I'm also curious what your purview is like for the next. So, in terms of China, right? So maybe the next 10 years won't be that different from this, from where we are now. But what are you looking at for your research, And now I mentioned at the very beginning, the introduction of the podcast, that you're the new director of RAND China Research Center. What's your vision for the center? What the China work will be most fruitful in the next 10 years, given all the constraints that we obviously are facing?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for allowing me to plug the China Center for a minute. So we're pretty new, and we're in some sense getting our sea legs ready. We're doing a few things. One is we're trying to make sure we're addressing gaps in the policy conversation here. What are the areas of research on China that are important, but most think tanks are not in a position to work on? I would say, in academia, there's a lot of great work being done, but the problem is, as you know well, Weifeng, it takes way too long for academic work to come out, and it's not really packaged in a way to deliver insights to policymakers. So we're trying to split the difference of lower elevation than academia, but a higher elevation than most think tanks. So we're running projects on assessing where and why Chinese industrial policy is a success or a failure. So not just taking industrial policy as a lump sum, but actually understanding that there are certain areas where China is better positioned to have success in industrial policy, and there are areas where we think it just won't work, and trying to understand the difference. I'm running a project on assessing key decisions that Xi Jinping has made over the 13 years he's been in power, and trying to draw from that a set of heuristics of how he makes decisions in the aggregate. I find a lot of the writing on Xi Jinping, and I'm guilty of this as well, isn't based on a careful examination of all of the policy decisions he's made over 13 years. It's sort of based on reading a few speeches and then saying, he is a Marxist, he isn't a Marxist, arguments about, is Taiwan the most important thing to him, or is it secondary to other objectives, and basing that on, rhetoric. And so what we're going to do is carefully go through 13 years of big decisions he's made on a range of domestic and foreign policy issues, and try to draw some scientific lessons about, look, he's made a lot of decisions. Let's interrogate them and see if we can draw some lessons learned. We will be starting up a podcast. I used to run one at CSIS. We'll be starting a similar one, trying to really interview people like Weifeng Zhong, who are doing interesting things on China, so that way we can help people not from China who listen to the podcast have a better understanding of its political and economic system. We'll be just doing a sort of range of research projects in those, in that vein.
All of that sounds very exciting. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I know we need to wrap this up soon, but I wanted to say that I really learned a great deal from our chat, Jude, and thank you so much for joining our podcast. I hope you'll come back next time to talk more to our audience about China again.
First of all, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. I'm excited for the podcast, and look forward to listening to future episodes.
Thank you.